Here we go. All right, we're recording. I think this is episode 39 or thereabouts. We're in Just This by Richard Rohr. And so good to be here tonight. And for all of you who are watching the archive, welcome. And if you would like to join us live, please take a look at the comments. All the information is there so you can join us if you'd like to. We would love to have you with. And we know that there's a lot of people watching. Be great to meet you and actually hear your voice. So feel free to join us anytime. We're going to be starting tonight on page 59, emptying the mind and filling the heart. So before we go there, is there any unfinished business, any old business, anything that you'd like to pick up from last week, something that you've been processing, something underdeveloped? All right, going once, going twice. Ah, William's here. Hi, William. Wouldn't be complete without William.
Hey yo.
There he is. Hey, yo. Isn't that what Ed McMahon used to say on the Johnny Carson? Was it "Hey-o" or he had something like that he used to say. It was just flashing when William said that. All right. Never mind. That went nowhere. All right, page 59. Emptying the mind, filling the heart. Let's read through the section and then we'll dig in. Maybe before I dive in here, remember we are in chapter 2, which has been more about the how of contemplative practice. And I don't know if you've noticed, but as we're getting deeper into this chapter, it's getting more and more specific about the various techniques and what it is we're actually doing when we are practicing contemplative prayer and just life through contemplative eyes. So it's been getting more specific as I see it. So it's been great that way, more interesting. Anyway, emptying the mind, filling the heart, page 59. To keep the mind space open, you need some form of meditative practice, something much more than saying prayers. In fact, if recitation of prayers does not lead to a change in consciousness, it is actually counterproductive. Authentic prayer is invariably a matter of both emptying the mind and filling the heart, and often one follows the other. To do that, you normally have to move beyond recited, formulaic, and social prayers to bring the mind down into the heart or the heart up into the mind. Either way works. The early Desert Fathers and Mothers spoke of the prayer of quiet, which, once learned, allows you to pray all the time. To keep the heart space open, you almost always need emotional healing in regard to past hurts. The heart space is most commonly opened by grief, music, conscious empathy, art, dance, nature, fasting, poetry, other honoring sexuality, and the entire art and suffering of relationship itself. Your heart needs to be broken and broken open at least once to discover what your heart means and to have a heart for others. I find almost no exceptions to that. All right, anything that jumped out at you? Any initial reactions? Anything you disagree with, initially at least? Anything triggering? All right, apparently not. Even the heart needs to be broken part? Nobody took issue with that? Where's
Okay, so I
Laura?
did get triggered. I did get triggered, but it triggered me in this other direction that's not even relevant. It triggered me into this political realm of um, talking about whether someone can have a heart for children that has never had children. And what struck me about that whole conversation is that conversation is only being applied in terms of women. They only bring it up in terms of women, but they don't bring that up in terms of men, whether men have had children or not, and having that be a prerequisite for whether you can have a heart for children or not. that was something that really struck me. So, having a heart for others, what are the prerequisites for having a heart for others?
Well,
It
according to
triggered,
Richard
it
Rohr,
didn't
it's that
trigger me.
your heart needs to be broken.
Hmm.
Yeah.
My heart is broken right now, so I guess that's working there. Yeah.
Okay.
I kind of didn't, I kind of read the words, but when it got to the heart being broken, that reached me a little bit more because of maybe where I am right now, having to be maybe rebroken and kind of going back to the first step. So having some loss and some breakiness. Yeah, I don't know, many breaks here and there, including the heart being pugged and broken. So I related to that as necessary to start feeling for others, empathy for things occurring around me and for people.
That's good. I thought of the achy breaky heart when you're talking about breakiness. I like that. Yeah. And when he refers to the first step, he is referring to the first step of AA because
Oh, I'm
I know
sorry.
that because we were talking about that earlier. But so admitting our powerlessness, which is another form of having your heart broken, right? If you think about it.
Well, a necessary step, I guess, is the first step. Can't go to the others until you do the first step. And I think the first step includes being broken and
Hmm.
things being unmanageable and just kind of in a little bit of a pit finally. But realizing you're in a pit and realizing you aren't the one to get out of that pit without some help. So something like that.
Very
I
good.
I was affected by the previous paragraph. To keep the heart space open, you almost always need emotional healing in regard to past hurts. And as you were reading through, my brain just stopped and said, "Well, how do you get that emotional healing?" I mean, so, I mean, he just kind of moved past that. And so, if I haven't had emotional healing for past hurts, am I unable to have an open heart space? So I was
Very.
kind of left hanging.
I'm really glad you singled that out, Ken. And when we get up to it, we're gonna talk about that in more detail because that is a huge piece. And yeah, and he does just kind of blow past it at 60 miles an hour, doesn't he? But yeah, we'll stop and consider that more because that's huge.
And the comment about men not being brought in there, but just the women, it was a good point. I'm a dog lover, so I'm not a cat, I guess I'm catless because I have a dog, but I don't know if that applies to the discussion or not. So,
No, it
Not
doesn't. Not at all.
at all. That
All
was a
right.
good one. Thanks, Doug.
Of course, I'm a cat lover, so they get included.
There you go. Let's go back up to the top and let's start to fill in some gaps here. All right, so to keep the mind space open, you need some form of meditative practice. To keep the mind space open, you need some form of meditative practice, something much more than saying prayers. We've talked about this over and over again. If you're saying prayers, if you're saying words, if you're even thinking the words, then you're playing within the egoic space. You're still in that sphere. What we're trying to do in contemplation is to become more expansive than that, to move beyond just the part of our minds that thinks in words and reasons and compares and contrasts and does all those functional issues that keep us in that small space. We're trying to move past that. So if we're going to keep our mind space open, if we're going to be expansive that way, we're going to need some form of meditation. It can be so many different things, but what it's not going to be is word-based. What it's not going to be is logical and rational. It's going to move past that. It's going to be what at least Rohr has called trans-rational. It's not irrational. It can be trans-rational, I suppose. But at any rate, it transcends that. And so saying prayers keeps us locked in if we're using words. And in fact, he says if recitation of prayer does not lead to a change in consciousness, it's actually counterproductive. So what kind of prayer is going to lead to a change in consciousness? You know, if we're saying words, most likely we are reciting and rehearsing what we already think we know within traditions that we're already familiar with. And that's going to keep us locked in to the consciousness we already have. Einstein said that you can't solve a problem with the same consciousness that created the problem. That's kind of what we're doing if we keep reciting prayers, especially within a certain theological tradition. Then we're rehearsing and deepening the consciousness we already have. But when we go silent, when we allow ourselves just to be in pure presence, then anything and everything becomes possible. It's a completely different experience, kind of the difference of, when you're on that ride at Disneyland, you think you're in a boat, but you're really on a track, because the boat's on the track underneath the water and you feel like you're in the water, but then if you were to get off the track and just be bobbing free in the water, now any direction is possible. You're no longer on the track. It's kind of the way I visualize that. We want to get off the track. We want to have every direction, any direction become possible. We want to be able to be blown about by the wind of the Spirit and see where we end up. Not have any certain destination in mind, not have any path delineated. Everything becomes possible, and it really does become an adventure at that point because you are past your planning. Another analogy that has crossed my mind is, when I played football in high school, I was terrible. I don't know why I even bothered. It was just like the next thing that I did. I joined I went out for football, and pretty much they take everybody as fodder for tackle dummies, I suppose. But anyway, I was, and being the kind of kid I was, I learned the playbook backward and forward. I knew all the plays, right? But when they put me in on a scrimmage or something, once the play was done, I didn't know what to do. And if you think about it, the true artistry of football, or really any game, starts where the play ends. It's when the play ends and what you do there, that's where you are a star. And I didn't know what to do after the play ended. But a great football player, once the play is over and they've got the ball, then they're spinning and whirling and they're doing whatever it is that they do to try to get to the goal line. But it's not predictable anymore. That's the adventure. And as long as we're reciting prayers, we are on the track. We're still running by the playbook. What happens when we let go of those prayers is different. Now, that doesn't mean that the recitation of prayers can't also put us on a contemplative track. For instance, if you're saying the rosary, what you're doing is you're giving the monkey mind, just this task to perform. You're not even counting the beads. You're just going bead to bead, and you're saying prayers that you know in muscle memory. You don't have to think about them at all. They just tumble out of you. The Hail Marys, the Our Father, the Glory Bees, and prayer beads in every spiritual tradition are used as means of being able to move into a meditative state. And so the saying of prayers can also be used that way. It depends on how much we're thinking about the prayer that we're saying. If we can recite the prayer without thinking about it, then we can also go into a meditative state. But if we're really thinking about it and we're trying to express ourselves rationally, then we're back on the track again. And so the point that he's making is huge here. To keep the mind space open, to go into that expansive place, that liminal space, right? That pure presence, we need some form of meditative practice where we are not thinking about it. Something much more than saying prayers. In fact, if recitation of prayer does not lead to a change in consciousness, it's actually counterproductive. Any thoughts there? I know we've said this before. We're just trying to say it again, maybe in a slightly different way.
So, Dave, I do a lot of my meditation with background music, but I'm not focused on the music. I'm trying to get into that subliminal place. But I do use music, especially when I'm going to sleep. It helps me calm down, find serenity, find peace, make a connection with God. Is that counterproductive?
No, no, not necessarily. What kind of music are you usually playing?
It's just it's not like jazz or anything. It's just there's random, tones, and I don't even know how to describe it. It's just
Okay, so it's more ambient.
ambient. That's it. That's the word I
Okay.
wanted. It's
Yeah,
ambient.
that's great because that doesn't have a lot of tension release highs and lows
No,
that draw your
no,
attention to it. Certainly doesn't have lyrics, so you're not
no.
drawn to the spoken word. So yeah, that would be the best case scenario. What I would say is see if you can consider that kind of training wheels on the bike. Where you really would like to get would be pure silence, if you can, but it's fine. I mean that if you're getting to the same place. But maybe try going from music like that, maybe to just wind or some environmental sound that's even less, um,
Well, sometimes it's
embedded.
rain or
Yeah,
wind or
and
yeah,
then maybe and see if you can back into silence. Maybe just for the last few minutes of your meditational sit, just
yeah.
turn it
I
off
do because
and
once the
see.
mute, it's set for a set period of time,
Okay,
and then it goes to silent,
there you
and I'm
go.
still aware, so it gets me started, I guess.
Absolutely. And that's absolutely fine. Of course, really anything can be fine. It's really not so much what you are using as your technique as much as getting to the state that we're talking about. So if you're doing a walking meditation, let's say, instead of just being still and sitting, that's fine as well, as long as you can get into that same state. And so that's really the key. That's why I say even reciting prayers, the ancients used to say the Jesus prayer hundreds of times a day, which is just, Jesus, have mercy on me, a sinner. They'd say it hundreds of times a day until the prayer was saying them, is the way they put it. But what it means is that it just goes so much into muscle memory that they're not even aware they're saying it anymore. But what it does do is ground you in the moment. Those mantras can help ground you, especially if you're really living in an anxiety. The mantra can help ground you in the moment. And after a while, you're not even thinking about the mantra, you're still saying it because it's part of what you've been practicing to do. But it can get you again to that place that we're talking about.
Yeah,
So
the
yeah,
rosary does that for me. When
yeah,
you
that's
talk about the
that's
rosary,
great. Yeah,
it does do that for me. Okay.
perfect. Yeah, as I like to say, it doesn't matter so much the horse you rode in on, just get to the barn. All right. Okay, paragraph 2, authentic prayer is invariably a matter of both emptying the mind and filling the heart, and often one follows the other. Um, I am not so thrilled with the phrase emptying the mind. Um, that might be counterproductive if we're not really clear about what we mean by emptying the mind. What I would rather say is displacing the content in our mind rather than trying to empty it. We're going to displace it. Now, it can mean the same thing, and obviously Richard Rohr knows the difference. But emptying the mind can sometimes give us the sense that we're supposed to force everything out of our mind. We're supposed to resist any thoughts that come in and push them out or push them down, wish them into the cornfield. And as we're doing that, we're back into thinking again. And we're actually bringing our attention to a point and a focus. And that's what we're trying not to do. So it's really the opposite of trying to empty affirmatively, but we just come back to whether it's a sacred word, you come back to your breathing, you come back to your music, even whatever, that you can just lay gently in your consciousness and then displace all the thoughts that are intruding and taking you out of presence. So that might be a very nuanced point, but in case any of you are really working to empty your mind, I don't know that your mind ever becomes empty. We're aware of the thoughts that are in there. We just pay them no never mind. Okay, we just don't focus on them, and that's a different kind of experience, I guess, if you will.
Dave, I I kind of put a bookend on that. When we were driving back this last week, we stopped with my nieces and stayed at in Palisades, Colorado, in the middle of a peach orchard. Believe it or not, I didn't even know they had peach orchards in Colorado. But um, the first morning we were there, I was able to just have a cup of coffee and go sit out on the porch, and I just was listening, and I realized first I heard a mourning dove over to the left, and then there was some other bird out in the hinterland somewhere. Then there was this layer of insects, I don't know, crickets or something, and I was just sitting and realizing how much when my mind is so focused so much of the time, I'm just not aware of what is actually going on at this sub nature level, that I just never stop enough to think about it. And so I like the word you use, displacing, because emptying is just so I don't know, aimless to me in one sense, because God is so silent for me right now. So, but listening like that, I was just more aware of just slowing it down and being able to hear differently than what I'm programmed to think, how many miles we got to drive tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And displacement hits me a lot better than emptying. At least I don't know.
Yeah.
I just am at this point where it's so hard to listen for a silent God.
It's focusing on, I suppose, what you do want, and displacing what you don't, rather than actively trying to evacuate the system. And what we do want is just, it's just presence. You put the boat in the water and it displaces its weight in the water. And if you put your sacred word down in your mind, it displaces everything around it. If you just sip the coffee and you let that sensation completely fill you as you're sitting on the porch looking at the peach orchard, then it displaces everything else. And you don't even do it. You're not even, it's effortless. All you do is put the boat in the water, put yourself in the space, and everything else for that moment is displaced. It's like that. If you're really working at it, like serenity now, then that's not going to do it. So that's why I just wanted to make that distinction. He is going to make a distinction later on that kind of defines more what emptying the mind is, but I wanted us to spend a little bit of time on it so that we just understand we're not trying to create a vacuum in our minds and pull everything out. We're occupying that space with spirit and with ourselves, and that displaces.
It
It's a
just
little different.
Other
I just
traditions
had oh,
don't
go ahead.
use emptying, they use clearing the mind. And to me, clearing is not, I guess it could be a displacement, but I don't see it as you were describing, kind of forcing or pushing
Mm-hmm.
out to clear your mind. Well, and like I said, I like the idea of other traditions talking about that emptiness as a clearing. And for me, it seems to be a very, um, I don't want to say, more of like a holistic kind of releasing in that clearing.
No, I like releasing. Releasing is good, but really clearing, releasing, emptying, displacing, use whatever your word you want to. I mean, that's up to you. Whatever works for you. It's just a word, but let's just try to be clear about what it is we're doing. Okay. I don't know that your mind will ever be completely silent, um, but you don't have to think about what is going on in there. Your senses will still be picking up everything in your environment, and you're going to be aware of them. In fact, you're going to be hyper aware of them. That's fine. That's as it should be. But you don't think about them. You just let them roll on past you, and you're just, you're moving with it all. You know, it's like, I think I've told you before, the first time I went on a hot air balloon, I was completely unprepared for the experience. I thought we'd get up there in that balloon, in that gondola, and there'd be all this wind and all that. We got up in the gondola and it was perfectly still, as if we were sitting right here in your living room. And it took me a second to realize you're being pushed by the wind, same velocity, same direction. Of course it's all still. you know? And so it's like that in contemplation too. When you are flowing with the current, then it's perfectly still and it feels silent, even if it's not completely silent.
I think there's an issue about words. I think that many people, well, we think with words. And so when the mind is active, it's words, it's pictures, it's stories, it's encoded events. And I think there's also an issue with words with prayer, because I think a lot of people just say things. They don't move into a space where they can listen or pay attention.
Mm.
So in this thing with contemplation, what I experienced, this didn't happen, it's just my cartoon image, is that God is not saying, sit down and talk with me. But rather it's more like sit down and know with me.
Mm. I like that.
Which you can't do if you're using your words in prayer, or which you can't do if you're using your words to try and stop the mind from using its words. That's what I think is such a gift of contemplative prayer, to try and get to that place where you're not paying attention to the mind's activity, because it's always going to be, but rather seeking to know with God who knows.
Yeah.
I find too that when I try to say, oh, meditate, concentrate, it doesn't work. I've had in the past, now I look back, several instances where it's what you call authentic prayer, wordless. I remember when my girls were, maybe they were 3 years old, 5 years old, we used to sleep together, and I was sleeping with them. Maybe it was 1 in the morning, I wake up and I will smell their hair, I will smell their skin, and I'll just watch them breathe. And it's 1 in the morning, suddenly, and it was just quiet. It was just me and the girls. And then far off in the distance, I hear this train whistle. And it was the most calming sound. Now, every time from far away, I hear the same train whistle. It just gives back this peaceful, serene feeling. And I felt like, I remember, this is life. I remember that. They were both, one on my left side, one on my right side. And I remember saying, this is life. I felt joy and love. And that was it. That was it. There was no words. And the more I tried to say, oh, concentrate, do this, it doesn't happen. It just happens. And like I remember last year too, I was in the backyard with my sisters in a foggy morning in Oakland at 6 in the morning. I was drinking my coffee, and suddenly I just looked up at the sky and just felt that wordless, yeah, peace and serenity. And I cannot duplicate it. I go to the same, you can't duplicate it.
You can't, no, you can't make it happen, like you're saying, but you can get really good at repeatedly creating the perfect environment for it to happen. How's that? Okay. We can
Yeah.
do that. We can create the environment for us to be able to fall into that kind of experience. And that's what we can repeat. But we don't make it happen. You don't push the river. You become part of the flow of the river. And as we get better and better at not focusing on our thoughts, that's where we can enter the flow. And then we'll have that's a beautiful image that you just gave us with that train whistle. I love that. Just love that.
So what you're saying is, with the result of that meditation, the filling of the heart comes as a result, right?
Yes.
I'm like waiting until you get there. Yeah. So, but that's what I'm getting from the meditation part, results in filling the heart.
It's kind of a byproduct, if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah.
Of us moving into a space. And the more it's like anything else we can train ourselves to do, more and more reliably and quickly we can move into that space, and then whatever happens, happens. But remember, we're off the track now. So we're not going to be able to predict what's going to happen. We're not going to plan it, and it's going to happen. It's the adventure part of it. We don't know what's coming. And that's the beauty of contemplative prayer.
But I like what he says, to bring the mind down into the heart, or the heart up into the mind.
Yeah.
Isn't that what Gail's saying?
I don't know.
Gail, is that what you were saying?
No, I'm saying that once you're doing the meditation and your mind is quieted, the result, as Ellen had said, you feel that peace.
Yeah, but I think that's what she's saying too, is that she brought her heart to her mind, or her mind to her heart. They became one because her heart was filled with love and peace. Is that how you felt, Ellen?
Yeah. It was just this, it just comes down and you just felt this peace. And
yeah.
So we're going to be throwing all these different word pictures and metaphors and phrases at this thing, and whatever sticks with you. So Jerry, if bringing the mind down to the heart, or the heart up to the mind, if that is the picture that makes it come alive for you, then hang on to that. If for someone else it doesn't really work, and for Tony it's clearing the mind, or for Bill it's displacing the thoughts, well, then that's what we hang on to. These are just images. But whatever gets you into the clearest understanding of what that feels like, that's what we want to hang on to. Okay? All of these are just placeholders. All of these are just someone trying to express what's largely inexpressible. All right? So he's saying authentic prayer is invariably a matter of both emptying the mind and filling the heart, and often one follows the other. To do that, you normally have to move beyond recited, formulaic, and social prayers to bring the mind down into the heart, or the heart up into the mind. Either way works, but he's basically the same thing. Maybe we can say we fill the mind with the heart and therefore displace all that egoic content. Maybe that's another way that we can look at it. But however you look at it, just remember, we're not trying to push stuff out. We're trying to become part of a flow. Brady?
I have a question, and that is, if I were to ask Richard Rohr, how do you define the heart? What would he say?
I think that he would say that it is the seat of all of our empathy and compassion. It is the seat of our kind of our conscious, maybe emotive even connection. It's beyond anything that's just sentimental in that way. It is the seat of all of our, I guess, the seat of our consciousness in a way. It's that connective point. But the heart, mostly in contrast to the mind, being not rational, not word-based. If the mind is understood as rational and word-based and thinking and planning, then the heart is just the place of pure repose, the
Sounds
place
sacred.
of connection.
It sounds sacred.
Yes, that can be too. Absolutely. Yeah. To the Jews, that was the heart. The Libhon was this center of all of our conscious and emotive and connective activity. And I think he's going in that direction. But I think for our purposes here, the main contrast is between the rational and the trans-rational, or the non-rational, between word-based and then just pure awareness. I think would be the thing that would work the best for us.
And you know what I mean, that one of the things that happens if I'm meditating, one of the signs for me that the meditation is starting to work, or in my sense that I'm doing it right, is I get flooded with a feeling of cheerfulness. And I've heard other people say that that's one of the first signs of spiritual enlightenment, is a sense of cheerfulness. And it really works for me. That's usually how I know that it's working, is when that
that cheerful feeling comes in. But I could see how you could see cheerfulness is putting more stress on your heart than your rational mind. So
Okay. And when John says cheerfulness, I mean, some of us are going to get the impression of some kind of emotion, of maybe even some sort of euphoria, or sort. It doesn't have to be that. It can just be that deep centered sense of okayness, contentment. Everything is okay. And so it may not have an emotion attached to it at all. And I think that's where John was going, and his head was going up and down right now. So I think that's what he was meaning. But I just want to make sure that if you bring to your meditative sit, oh, I've got to feel really good, I've got to be cheerful, I got to be happy. Well, now you're already back on a track, and that's not going to work. You just let what happen. But there is this sense of okayness, I think, that permeates when you do go into this pure present state.
I think one of the reasons cheerfulness works for me is that I'm naturally kind of pretty depressive or depressed. So I think if you're not as depressed as me, as I often do, that the cheerfulness seems pretty wild.
Good point, John. Good point. All right.
Dave, I'm kind of having a hard time separating the mind and the heart in a sense, because I can see that there's times when my mind will keep running away with things, but then there's what I described to her earlier is that my mind became aware of slowing down. It became aware of what was around me, and it was connected to the heart. It felt good, but the mind was also interpreting for me, wow, there's more going on here. It's like there's some connection there. So it's hard to be either or for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's make the other distinction too. We can be aware of things that are happening without thinking about them egoically. So if you had this awareness that you're slowing down, but you weren't actually putting that into words, then in our context here, that would still be heart activity as opposed to mind activity. Does that make
the mind realizes what the heart is starting to connect to for me.
And are you thinking that in words? Are you talking to yourself and saying, "Oh, hey, I'm connecting now"?
No, well, part of it, but there was a realization, I guess, of how fast my mind was moving, and all of a sudden I'm quieted and directly in the moment, and these things in nature kept presenting themselves, and I'm like, my mind was aware how fast it was moving, and it was just able to just shut off, relax, and it just was a relief to listen to what the next thing in nature around me was starting to chirp. So it's kind of hard to, I guess when you say the ego, I'm thinking more in terms of what we try and direct ourselves. And when I let go of the ego, my mind can still be aware of what my senses are starting to pick up on in what's happening around me.
And that's what I would say is still heart activity as opposed to mind activity. If you're not thinking about it, comparing and contrasting, judging things in any way, that's what the mind does. But to just be aware of it without thinking about it, that doesn't break the contemplative state. And so that would still be heart as opposed to mind. As soon as you start thinking about it, now you've left the contemplative state and you're back into the egoic bubble, if you will. So
I guess I need more definition around the egoic.
Dave,
or maybe less definition and you just experience
it. I was having a conversation that I think last week I brought up this idea of, the ego likes to take credit for things we're doing. So I am thinking and I am breathing. But if we ask ourselves the question, I think Alan Watts was the guy that kind of brought up this riddle. He says, like I can quicken my breath or slow my breath down and say, I am breathing. But what happens when I am not thinking about my breathing and I'm focused on something else? Like, who's breathing at that point? Right? And making a parallel between that thought and I am thinking, right? Basically, the brain is this blob of interconnected tissue that fires neurological impulses. And it's doing that when I'm sleeping, when I'm focused on something, it's doing it all the time, right? So we have this tendency to say, I am thinking, but what's happening is my brain is firing impulses that I am interpreting as my thoughts, right? And it's happening all the time in this very automatic cause and effect kind of a way, right? So if I'm outside and I'm listening to the sounds of the crickets and I'm listening to the birds, they're going to trigger neurons in my brain and they're going to fire, and that's going to create thoughts. And like and what we're being called to do is be present to the sound of the crickets and the birds and the thoughts, right, as they're coming out of this brain organism, right? So it's like, my heart is beating on its own. I'm breathing on my own. When I'm sleeping, I'm not conscious of my breathing. I'm doing that on my own. And the brain is doing what it does on its own. And it's when I am allowing the brain's activity, which is just an automatic cause and effect, electrical transmission of whatevers, when I start to over-identify with that. And I start to say, I am the one who's thinking, when the brain is just recalling and responding to stimuli. And then when I'm actually thinking, I think thinking should be much more active, like a solution oriented. I'm thinking about a problem, I'm planning an event or something like that. But this brain firing kind of activity that just is always happening in the background, I think that's something other than thinking. Like that's just the brain doing what the brain does.
I think that's a really good distinction that you're making, and especially the parallel that you're making between respiration and thought production, because they do happen in the background. The brain is always producing thoughts, right? Always firing. But just like we don't have to think about our breathing, or we can think about our breathing and try to regulate it, we can think about our thoughts too, or not. That's the key. We don't have to think. We can just let them go on by. We can let them do their thing in the background, and we are just present to all of that, both the internal stimuli and the external stimuli that's also coming through the brain. But we don't have to interpret it. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to try to control it or regulate it in any way. We're just present to it. And that's where the displacing comes in. So if that helps you, whatever helps, whatever doesn't, take what you need and leave the rest, right? We're throwing a lot of stuff at the wall here to see what might stick. Let's do this.
Oh,
The next sentence. Wait. The next sentence. The early desert fathers and mothers spoke. The early desert fathers and mothers spoke of prayer of quiet, which once learned allows you to pray all the time. So what I want to do is share my screen. And I'll read some passages from, this is Henry Nouwen, The Way of the Heart. Can you all see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, just a couple of pages of this, and let's see if this helps to lock this in. When Arsenius had asked for the second time, Lord, lead me to the way of salvation, the voice that spoke to him not only said, be silent, but also pray always. To pray always, this is the real purpose of the desert life. Solitude and silence can never be separated from the call to unceasing prayer. If solitude were primarily an escape from a busy job, and silence primarily an escape from a noisy milieu, they could easily become very self-centered forms of asceticism. But solitude and silence are for prayer. The Desert Fathers did not think of solitude as being alone, but as being alone with God. They did not think of silence as not speaking, but as listening to God. Solitude and silence are the context within which prayer is practiced. The literal translation of the words pray always is come to rest. The Greek word for rest is hesychia, and hesychasm is the term which refers to the spirituality of the desert. A hesychast is a man or a woman who seeks solitude and silence as the ways to unceasing prayer. The prayer of the hesychast is a prayer of rest. This rest, however, has little to do with the absence of conflict or pain. Just like Jesus said, I didn't come to bring you tranquility or calm, peace, but a sword. Same thing here. It is a rest in God in the midst of a very intense daily struggle. Abba Anthony even says to a fellow monk that it belongs to the great work of a man to expect temptations to his last breath. Hezekiah, the rest which flows from unceasing prayer, needs to be sought at all costs, even when the flesh is itchy, the world alluring, and the demons noisy. Mother Theodora, one of the desert mothers, makes this very clear. You should realize that as soon as you intend to live in peace, at once evil comes and weighs down your soul through anxiety, a sense of boredom, faint-heartedness, and evil thoughts. It also attacks your body through sickness, debility, weakening of the knees and all the members. It dissipates the strength of soul and body so that one believes one is ill and no longer able to pray. But if we are vigilant, all these temptations fall away. Although weakness of the knees is not likely to be our main complaint, we ministers have no lack of excuses, often very sophisticated ones, for staying away from prayer. For us, however, prayer is as important as it was for the early Desert Fathers. Let me therefore explore the role of prayer in our daily lives. Now, he goes into the prayer of the mind, but what I want to do is talk about the prayer of the heart. So let's continue on page 75 here. Hesychastic prayer, which leads to that rest where the soul can dwell with God, is prayer of the heart. For us who are so mind-oriented, it is of special importance to learn to pray with and from the heart. The Desert Fathers can show us the way. Although they do not offer any theory about prayer, their concrete stories and counsels offer the stones with which later Orthodox spiritual writers have built a very impressive spirituality. The spiritual writers of Mount Sinai, Mount Athos, the Startse of 19th century Russia are all anchored in the tradition of the desert. We find the best formulation of the prayer of the heart in the words of the Russian mystic Theophan the Recluse. Don't you love that name, Theophan the Recluse? To pray is to descend with the mind into the heart. There you go, Jerry. And there to stand before the face of the Lord, ever present, all seeing within you. To descend with the mind into the heart, and there to stand before the face of the Lord, ever present, all seeing within you. All through the centuries, this view of prayer has been central in hesychasm. Prayer is standing in the presence of God with the mind in the heart. That is, at the point of our being where there are no divisions or distinctions and where we are totally one. And maybe that helps with our definition of heart. There God's Spirit dwells, and there the great encounter takes place. There heart speaks to heart, because there we stand before the face of the Lord, all-seeing within us. We have to realize that here the word heart is used in its full biblical meaning. In our milieu, the word heart has become a soft word. It refers to the seat of the sentimental life. Expressions such as heartbroken and heartfelt show that we often think of the heart as the warm place where the emotions are located, in contrast to the cool intellect where our thoughts find their home. But the word heart in the Jewish Christian tradition refers to the source of all physical, emotional, intellectual, volitional, and moral energies. Okay? I don't know if that helps. I don't think the next paragraph gets us any further. But I wanted to try to flesh out this idea of the Desert Fathers and Mothers and the prayer of quiet that he's talking about here. Because it's a huge piece of this whole thing, and to understand what he's talking about. And then finally, with the last few minutes that we've got, to keep the heart space open, you almost always need emotional healing in regard to past hurts. So what he's talking about here is that if we are still actively suffering from the unconscious programming, from core beliefs, from thought and behavior patterns that come from the traumas and the hurts of the past, starting all the way back in childhood, that roiling down there in the unconscious is going to make it very difficult, if not impossible, for us to be able to move into the space that we're talking about. And so at the Effect, our mission has always been, since we started out as a recovery ministry, was to work with people, starting from a clinical point of view, to be able, if they're underwater, if they're still in the midst of their compulsions and addictions and all of this, their emotional dysregulation, not able to find any kind of equilibrium in their life, either relationally or emotionally, then the first thing we got to do is get them up to the waterline, get them to a place of equilibrium. And we're going to use everything that we have at our disposal in order to do that. We can't over spiritualize when someone is in that state of dysregulation and just say that we can pray that away, or by doing contemplative prayer from that point, they're going to be able to get where they need to go. This is where healing actually needs to take place. And so much of the healing that Jesus does, we can look at it literally and physically, but we can also look at it spiritually and metaphorically, that he's getting people into this place where now they have a platform, they have a foundation from which to be able to actually work. But until we're at some place of kind of an equilibrium, this movement into contemplative prayer is going to be blocked. So like I said, we start with the clinical. We start with the organic is what we want to do. So when we're first seeing somebody and assessing them and looking at how we're going to help them, if we are seeing signs that maybe there is some sort of organic problem, then we need to get them to a psychiatrist who can look at them from that point of view and apply medication or whatever may be needed to help them to get to a place of more equilibrium. If it looks like it is clinical and unconscious, then they need to go to a psychologist and they need to go to a therapist. And then if it's something that's more situational, well, then counseling may be able to help them to get where they need to go. But we want to utilize all of that. If there's substance use involved, then they need to go into rehab and we need to get them detoxed. All of those, to hopefully answer Ken's question, are going to be what we're going to need to do to get them to the place of emotional healing in regard to past hurts, whatever it takes and all of the above. Because until we get to a certain place of equilibrium, then the real spiritual direction can't take place. It's not that some of this can't be concurrent, but there is a sequence to all of this. And that's really an important point. And I don't know, Ken, if you're online, did that help you with the question that you asked? I may have lost Ken.
No, I had no unmute, sorry.
Okay.
No, I heard every word. That was very helpful.
Okay. But I think the most important thing, if you heard me, is that we can't over spiritualize this. Now, over the last 25 years that we've been doing this, we've come under a lot of fire, especially from other Christian ministries and churches, for even being 12-step oriented, because it's not 12 steps, it's just one step. Just give your heart to Jesus and you're a new creature in Christ. Some of the churches, even faulted us for working on psychological levels because psychology was something that was anti-scriptural. And so we've come under fire for that. But the truth of the matter is, if you over spiritualize this, if you try to approach substance abuse just by, through prayer or through spiritual methods, you're doing a lot of harm, because God uses all the facets of human healing, not just prayer, in order to affect the healing. And so we need to do the same thing, is our belief anyway. But that's getting the person up to the waterline. So there's work to do. And then from there, now we can start moving into real spiritual direction, spiritual formation, contemplative practice, and the rest.
But
I just heard Dave. Because when I first came in the program, I fought the spiritual part of it. And it's because I had so much healing to do. You just made a clarity for me. I had so much healing that I needed to do that I wasn't ready to do any spirituality. And once I got through the healing, at least a beginning, and I'm always healing. But once I got rid of a lot of the past and a lot of the hurt and a lot of the healing, then I was ready to move into the spirituality. So you just cleared that up for me. Thank you.
Sure. William?
I was thinking that he said almost always needs emotional healing, like to keep this heart space open. And I'm just thinking that it's possible to keep the heart space open while without healing. Or is that, am I splitting hairs?
Were you asking, is it possible to do it without emotional healing? Was that the question?
Yeah, while I'm still hurting, while I'm still experiencing all the pain there is, right? I just, I lost someone close to me, whatever that might be. And my heart is open to the experience of the loss and the sadness and the grief and the tears and saying goodbye and so on and so forth. And I suppose that there's healing in being open to that experience, but I don't. Am I splitting hairs here?
I think that's why he said almost. I mean, I'm sure there are going to be instances, and like I said, some of this stuff can be done concurrently. It doesn't have to be absolutely sequentially. I mean, when do you declare someone emotionally regulated anyway, right? I mean, this is not, they're not discrete steps on a continuum here.
Right.
But you need to get to a certain place. In kind of what you described there, William, that would be more grief than any kind of, neurosis or anything else that you're talking about. And yes, a person can find great emotional or spiritual growth in times of grief, in times of loss. In fact, it's the great suffering and the great love that really moves us through the process and down the path. But if someone is really stuck, like Jerry was talking about, I can't tell you that most of the clients that came through for rehab, for addiction treatment, had huge chips on their shoulders against the church and against Christianity and organized religion because they'd gone through so much abuse. I mean, why were they addicts in the first place, right? And there was no way that you're going to be able to talk about prayer or anything spiritual with them until they got to a place where at least, they were somewhat desensitized to all of that heat and past trauma. So there are some things that do need to get cleared up before, and then at a certain point you can continue to move on. And it's not that you're not talking to them about the spiritual, but there's a lot of other work that does need to be done before it can really start to take hold. And we're doing a disservice if we try to start in the wrong direction.
The thing that made the biggest difference for me early on was what they call shadow work. Because I didn't really have a therapist or, I wasn't on a medication, but I had been studying Jung and I understood the whole idea of the shadow and, accepting what was the shadow. And it had a profound way of speeding up my spiritual insight. I mean, after I got done with the shadow work, I could read, these books by Christian mystics and understand them. I mean, because they were describing my experience. The other thing I used was the idea that I had trauma stored in my body somehow, or in my back, or part of my face, or one of my arms. And by getting in touch with that trauma and relaxing it, again, I thought I had a huge boost in the sort of quality of my spirituality. And that's why I've always been interested when you talk about shadow work. Because like I said, it had a profound impact.
Yeah.
Oh, that's crazy. William, first of all, thank you for sharing. You blew my mind on that that I was thinking Eckhart Tolle, what, am I one or two people, right?
Mhm.
And even when I hear about grief, part of me says, you know, reason Eckhart Tolle said, am I one or two, or two people? Because he says, I can't live with, the I and the myself. Is that one or two people, right? And so as you were talking, I was hearing that. Then another part of me hooked up what Brady was saying. He asked, like, I thought, a most profound question of the night, which is, and I'll go quick here, which is, what does Richard Rohr think about the heart? But just prior to that, I think you shared about being in God's presence, right? And without opinion, right? Without ego, right? And that's like the I, but I don't think I can ever separate the I from myself. The grief that you're talking about, it 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 is me, right? It feels like it's two different people, but it's that heart open.
Mm-hmm.
It's the heart open, but I'm sharing that with God, and He's sharing with me that divine that I think Brady talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
my 2 cents.
And for the most part, you're having the same exact experience, but your awareness is both resting with the experience, the egoic experience, and this seed of consciousness at the same time.
The
And
same.
they're inseparable. They're happening.
You can't separate it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. In the immortal words of P.T. Barnum, leave them wanting more. So we're gonna need to stop there. And we didn't even finish this section. That's the first time I think we've missed a section, but we will back up one paragraph and we'll finish it next week. But yeah, man, this is a great discussion, and I'm hoping we're inching closer and closer to being able to be comfortable with the idea of contemplative practice. All right, Scotty.
Father God, we're so grateful to be here, and we thank you for the time we get to spend with you and with each other, and encouraging each other, and exploring and learning and just enjoying. It's a great privilege. We often take it for granted. So right now we just spend the moment to stop what we're doing and just thank you. Thank you for all that you make available to us, and how beautiful our lives can be. We love you, Lord. It's in your precious and holy name of Jesus. We pray and we give our thanks and we say amen. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Great discussion. We'll
Bye,
see you on
everybody. Good to see everybody
Sunday.
See you next
again.
week.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
Good
Good night, Sandy.
See you Sunday.
Good
Night.
night. Good night, Linda.
Good night. Thank you so much.
All right.
Good night, Linda.
Good, Sandy.
See y'all soon. Bye-bye.